Hey there everybody, Sage Popham here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and just finished up doing one of our weekly Q&A sessions here for all the students in our courses. And there's a really great question here talking about the concept in Ayurveda of the core constitution, or what is referred to as the Prakriti, in comparison to our current or assumed constitution, what is referred to as the Vikruti. And so in this week's post, they're talking about kind of how do you place importance on one or the other? How do you differentiate and determine what the difference between the core and innate constitution is versus the assumed constitution, and what are some things that you do in order to assess those? So that's what I'm going to be talking about in this week's post, and I hope you all enjoy. So our first question here is coming from Chelsea Braden in Materia Medica Monthly. And Chelsea is asking, I was wondering about how one figures out what their Prakriti and their Vikruti are. Is there a good method for analysis, good questions to ask, things to look at once I've learned about the doshas to determine one's individual balance and imbalances of each dosha? Or is there already a pre-existing list of questions created for that purpose? So thanks so much, Chelsea, for the question. This is a really good one. It's a common question that I get in various forms. So to define a few terms here, as Chelsea's question is involving some terms derived from Ayurveda. So talking about Prakriti and Vikruti. So for those of you that aren't familiar with these terms, these are two different kind of levels or layers of the human constitution. Prakriti is what we might consider our core constitution, or our innate natal constitution, right? It's when we are born into this world, we take that first breath of life, and we are infused with certain elemental patterns, certain astrological patterns that kind of predetermine the state of our body, organ system strengths and weaknesses, our psychological temperament, etc. So really everything about us is kind of stamped onto who we are at that moment of birth. And from the moment of conception up until the moment of birth is also determining a good amount of what that constitution is going to look like. So that includes the physical health of the mother, the psychological and emotional state of the mother, and I would also include the psychological and emotional state of the father is also affecting that child prenatally. So the Prakriti is kind of who we are on a core fundamental level. And these are the patterns that we tend to carry with us throughout our entire life. But there's this other layer of the constitution that in Ayurveda is referred to as Vikruti. Now, the Vikruti is our assumed constitution, right? It is it's kind of like if the Prakriti is the core of the onion, the Vikruti are the layers that get put on top of that core and change our constitutional state based on our environment, on the foods and drinks we consume, the medicines we consume, the thoughts we think, the people we interact with, our lifestyle, our habits, pretty much everything that we do will change our constitutional state. Vikruti is typically considered an imbalanced state because it's discordant with our core constitution. Generally speaking, from a therapeutic perspective, as herbalists, when we're working with people, we're typically interfacing with Vikruti, right? That's why people come to us, because they have some sort of imbalance. They have some sort of excesses or deficiencies that are giving them some problems. And so more often than not, we are directly working with the assumed constitution. Now, from an astrological perspective, the way that I tend to think of this is the Prakruti, or our core constitution, is directly reflected in our natal birth chart. The Vikruti, or the assumed constitution, is directly reflected in our transits, right? Or the current astrological weather as it's influencing the natal chart. And so that's one way that I've kind of come to think of the different layers of the constitution as you might find it in the astrology chart for our alchemical herbalism and astroherbalism and botanical constellation students. So, okay, so then to the question, how do we analyze this? Well, generally speaking, when we're just assessing the constitution as a whole, we are looking at patterns. And that's really what the Constitution is all about, is we're looking for patterns in a person and how those patterns are reflections of nature within them. So we're looking at the body, right? We're looking at, head to toe, really, the shape of the head, the texture and color of the hair, the brightness of the eyes, the color of the skin, the hydration of the skin. Is it really dry? Is it really damp? Is it really oily? We're looking at the overall shape of the body. Are they kind of egg-shaped, or are they very slender, or are they kind of medium? What's their predominant tissue, right? Do they seem to be more dominant in adipose tissue? Do they seem to be more dominant in muscle tissue? Are they more dominant in connective tissue? Kind of, you can kind of see all their tendons and ligaments in the joints. I'm observing hands a lot. Are the fingers really long with protruding joints? Are they kind of medium? Are they short and more thick? The tone of the voice, right? Do we have a really light and airy, more vata voice? Or do we have a really sharp and direct pitta voice? Or is it kind of more of a mellow, steady, calm kapha voice, right? These are all things that point us towards someone's constitutional patterns. Now, the difference is typically when someone's right in front of you, you're really looking at their current constitutional state. That might be different from the Prakruti, from the core constitution, right? Because, when you look at an onion, you typically see the most superficial layer, and it's not until you peel all those layers off that you see the core. So how do you differentiate between the two? Well, for all intensive purposes, working with what's right in front of you is the most important thing. But I think the main thing to consider here is that Prakruti is really the recurring themes, like what's the pattern that's woven throughout the entire life, right? And so, then that kind of gives you a glimpse into seeing what the big differences are between, where they are now versus where they typically have been throughout their whole life. Sometimes it's the same, sometimes it's not. And obviously, sometimes people don't really know like how they were when they were a kid or what they were like as an infant and things like that. So sometimes it can be really hard to differentiate. But I think the important thing is to just work with what's right in front of you. Now, in terms of you're asking about questions to ask, Prakruti-oriented questions are going to be, again, questions oriented around, what are the recurring things that you've struggled with? Or what are kind of what are like the thematic elements of your physiology and your psychology that seem to have been kind of stitched into the fabric of your life throughout your whole life. Whereas questions in regards to Vikruti are like, what's going on right now that you're struggling with and that you need help with? In terms of things to look at to determine one's individual balance and imbalance of each dosha. So that's going to be really individual. And I think it's really important to understand too that when we're talking about constitutional balance, it's unique to each person. So if we're using Ayurveda as an example, Vata, Pitta, Kapha, constitutional balance for someone doesn't mean a perfect balance of Vata, Pitta, and Kapha. It means, if someone has a core constitution, let's say of Pitta and Vata, and maybe they have less amounts of Kapha, their balance is going to be a higher level of Pitta and Vata in comparison to Kapha, but not to the point where this is in excess and not to the point where this is in deficiency. So every person has their own unique constitutional balance. And I think finding that balance is a big part of what life is about. I think it's really common for people to think that there's this goal of perfect balance that they have to get to, and once they get there, they'll be there forever. And it's just not the case. That's not the way life works. Life is constantly changing. Everything is in flux. And you can reach a perfect state of constitutional balance, but then a little breeze might blow, or maybe it'll start raining, or maybe you'll eat something, or you'll have an intense interaction with another person, and then all of a sudden the scales get tilted again. I think the question isn't, can we reach constitutional balance and stay that way forever, but more, how quickly are we able to make those adjustments to regain balance and making that time frame shorter and shorter and shorter. I think that's really what we're shooting for. And this is really all about self-knowledge, self-understanding, knowing how the outer world affects our inner world, right? How the weather and the seasons affect us, how the people we interface with affect us, how the foods that we eat affect us, and really being self-aware and knowing, oh, interesting, when I eat these things, I get irritable, or when I eat these things, I get really tired. Okay, maybe we need to adjust the diet a little bit, right? So it's really individual. And while we all want a very clearly set pattern for how to balance everything out, there are good guidelines, right? That, Pitta people generally shouldn't eat too many hot, spicy foods, and Vata people should try to remain calm and centered and grounded, and Kapha people, need to try not to be too sluggish or try not to get too lazy or things like that, right? There's these general principles for, lifestyle and dietary and therapeutic dynamics to consider to balance out the doshas, but really it's going to be very individual for each person. So I wouldn't say I'm sure you can do some research and find some pre-existing questions to help assess the doshas, but for me, and that can be a great place to start as a guideline, but for me, I really like to follow my intuition. And really the other thing about this too is that constitutional analysis is not, you don't have to wait until you have a client to do this stuff. It should become a lens through which you see the world. So when you're out and about and you're, at the check stand at the grocery store, you can just be paying attention to the person and listen to their voice and look into their eyes and just kind of assess their body and just kind of make mental notes. I think that's a really great approach. And that's really, when I first learned about this, I just made it a habit that I'm essentially always assessing people's constitutions and just paying attention and looking for those patterns. So that would be my answer to you, Chelsea, in regards to the difference between the Prakruti and the Vikruti, and how to assess those general patterns in people. And I think really, again, just to reiterate, the importance of just paying attention to what's right in front of you. And as I had said in a previous Q&A session, that really the Prakruti isn't always the most important thing to focus on, especially if someone has acute issues going on. Those are really what need to be corrected first. And then as you work through those patterns, you'll kind of whittle it down to the essence and get closer to, okay, this person is kind of coming back to center, coming back to their own innate balance, and now we can work with the fine tuning to maintain that balance.